Long before the cameras began rolling, before the political statements were drafted, there was something else, an unease rippling quietly across the African continent. Ordinary South Africans could feel it as they watched the headlines. The United States had just mocked their country for daring to open the doors of the G20 wider than ever before. Washington said South Africa's summit had become the G100, as if inclusion were an offense, as if inviting 42 nations, many from the global south, was some kind of diplomatic mistake. But to those standing on the ground in Johannesburg, there was no mistake. There was pride. There was anticipation. For the first time in history, the G20 was being held on African soil, and you could almost sense the electricity humming through the streets, business owners preparing for delegations, young people talking about Africa's future, and elders recalling a time when the continent's voice was not even invited into the room. This was more than a meeting. It was a long overdue moment. And that is why President Cyril Ramaphosa's response struck the world like a bolt of lightning. No anger, no theatrics, just firm conviction. He acknowledged the criticism from the United States, yet he stood tall and unshaken. Our G20 is about inclusion, he said. Not shrinking the table but expanding it. Not limiting voices but multiplying them. In a world drifting toward division, Ramaphosa insisted that Africa deserved to be heard not as a guest, but as a builder of the global future. And so a simple question hangs in the air. Is this the beginning of a new global order, one where Africa finally steps into the position it has long been denied? Or will the old powers push back even harder to protect a world they once controlled? If you feel this conversation matters, if you believe that truth should guide global leadership more than pride or politics, please share this video. And if you want to stay ahead of Africa's rising story, including voices from Burkina Faso, South Africa, and across the continent, make sure to subscribe. The world is changing, and you deserve to understand how. In Johannesburg, just days before the G20 would officially begin, there was a strange mixture of tension and pride settling over the city. Taxi drivers spoke about it at traffic lights. Shopkeepers mentioned it as they swept dust from their storefronts. Even families sitting at dinner tables found themselves repeating the same story. The United States had openly mocked South Africa for inviting too many nations to the G20 summit. To the average person, it felt like a familiar echo, another moment when Africa was told it had gone too far, even when all it had done was open its doors. Washington's message was blunt. Officials complained that South Africa had turned the G20 into a G100, diluting the forum, weakening its core, and straying from what the U.S. claimed was the proper original framework. It was not just a diplomatic critique. It sounded like a warning, a reminder of who had historically controlled global conversations. But what few people outside the continent understood was that South Africa's decision did not come from carelessness. It came from conviction. It came from years of watching decisions about Africa being made without Africa. And so, as the criticism mounted, the South African government stood firm. The global South deserved a seat at this table, and a narrower G20 was no longer enough for a rapidly changing world. President Cyril Ramaphosa stepped into this heated moment with a tone that was calm, almost measured, but unmistakably intentional. When he addressed the audience just 3 days before the summit, he reminded them of something profound. For decades, the G20 had been a gathering of wealthy nations representing 80% of the world's GDP, yet it had rarely, if ever, focused seriously on Africa. The continent that would soon hold 2.5 billion people had often been treated as a footnote rather than a partner. This time would be different. Ramaphosa emphasized the symbolism of the moment. For the first time, he said, "The G20 is being held on African soil." The room stirred. Some nodded, others shifted forward in their chairs. Everyone felt the weight of the milestone. It wasn't simply about geography. It was about dignity, about presence, about reclaiming space in global decision-making. He explained why South Africa had chosen to invite 42 additional countries. According to him, the world could not continue pretending that a handful of economies could speak for humanity. The problems nations face today, economic inequality, energy transitions, trade imbalances, population growth, were problems that demanded more voices, not fewer. And if the United States saw that as a threat, then perhaps it was time for the world to rethink who had been allowed to lead for far too long. Ramaphosa made it clear that inclusivity was not a buzzword, it was a necessity. Africa was no longer content with the role of observer. The African Union, he explained, was now a full member of the G20 thanks to South Africa's persistent campaign that had faced considerable opposition. Yet despite the resistance, they had prevailed. This was one of the first real victories for African representation on a global platform in decades. And he didn't stop there. The president outlined why the broad invitation list mattered. He mentioned trade. He mentioned investment. He highlighted the need for African leaders to meet not only in formal AU assemblies, but directly with business leaders, those who build, invest, and take risks. South Africa wanted this G20 to be different, a summit where governments and business communities worked hand in hand, exchanging concerns, addressing barriers, and shaping collaborative solutions. For ordinary South Africans listening to these words, the message resonated deeply. The image of a G100 was not a failure, it was a sign of confidence, a symbol of Africa's rising voice. And for the first time in a long time, people sensed that the continent wasn't just being included, it was being heard. Ramaphosa closed this section of his speech with a clear reminder: Africa's future would not be dictated from outside anymore. It would be built from within through partnership, unity, and a deliberate effort to place Africa at the center of global conversations. As the hall filled with murmurs and the soft hum of cameras preparing to record a distinct shift swept through the audience, people leaned closer. Some folded their arms, others set down their glasses instinctively, knowing something important was about to be said. And they were right. Because what came next was the turning point, the moment where diplomacy collided with defiance, where years of quiet frustration turned into a declaration heard far beyond the walls of that Johannesburg venue. President Cyril Ramaphosa paused, looked across the room, and revealed what many suspected, but few had heard spoken aloud. South Africa's push to bring the African Union into the G20 had faced enormous resistance. Not gentle disagreement, not bureaucratic hesitation, but outright opposition from several powerful players who preferred a G20 that remained tightly controlled, predictable, and, if they were honest, Western-centered. Yet, despite all that pressure, despite all those backroom objections, South Africa won. "We finally won the debate," he said. That single line broke the room open. Applause rose sharply, deep, emotional, almost relieved. It wasn't just a victory for South Africa. It was a victory for every African nation that had ever been told to wait your turn. And for many in that room, the realization washed over them like a tide. This G20 was no longer a summit happening near Africa. It was a summit happening with Africa. But Ramaphosa didn't stop at the symbolism. He leaned forward, voice steady, and stated the principle at the heart of the controversy. Our G20 is about inclusion. He said the word slowly, deliberately, inclusion, as if reclaiming a term the world had begun to treat with suspicion. He lamented that the word had become hated, twisted by political movements, and used as a wedge in divided nations. But Africa, he insisted, could not afford to fear inclusion. Africa needed it because exclusion had been its story for far too long. This declaration marked the emotional peak of the entire address. It was no longer about logistics or invitations or guest lists. It was about a continent demanding its right to shape the future. And then came another shift, unexpected but powerful. Ramaphosa revealed that 19 countries had sent media representatives to craft a joint G20 media declaration. Their focus issues often brushed aside in global summits: the persecution of journalists, the silencing of truth-tellers, the erosion of press freedom. This was not the traditional script of a G20 gathering. It was broader, more human, more reflective of how global politics affects everyday life. In that moment, it became clear South Africa's G20 was not meant to be a club meeting. It was meant to be a mirror, and the world didn't always like what it saw reflected there. But the reactions were not limited to applause and declarations. Throughout the room, emotions shifted in waves. Some business leaders exchanged nods, recognizing the doors that might open if Africa spoke with one collective voice. Others sat quietly thinking about the years when the AU's presence in global forums was considered optional rather than essential. At the same time, there was a subtle but undeniable awareness of tension. Everyone knew the United States had taken offense. Everyone knew certain European nations preferred a smaller, more manageable G20. And everyone understood that by enlarging the space, South Africa was challenging an established hierarchy that had remained untouched for decades. Still, Ramaphosa pressed forward. He highlighted that the upcoming meeting with African heads of state, those invited to join the G20 deliberations, was not a courtesy gesture. It was strategic. It was intentional. He wanted those leaders to showcase real investments made by South African companies across the continent, weaving economies together through trade infrastructure, technology, and finance. The message was crystal clear. If Africa wanted to change its standing in the world, it needed to act like a continent, prepared to lead, not follow. By the time Ramaphosa finished this climactic section, the atmosphere had transformed. What began as a defensive reaction to U.S. criticism had evolved into a bold declaration of continental identity. South Africa wasn't apologizing. It wasn't backtracking. It was moving forward, insisting that the world either walk with Africa or be left behind as history shifted. Long before economists debated graphs or policymakers argued over statements, ordinary South Africans were already feeling the effects of the moment. In small cafes around Johannesburg, you could hear young workers talking about the improving power supply. In rural towns, elders discussed how job numbers were finally beginning to rise. These were not abstract shifts, they were changes people could touch, small hints that the country was moving, however slowly, toward a more stable horizon. So when President Cyril Ramaphosa transitioned from the emotional high of Africa's diplomatic victory to the concrete realities facing the nation, he knew his audience was listening closely. He began listing the improvements not with triumph, but with a quiet confidence that suggested a long journey was finally beginning to pay off. South Africa, he explained, had recorded encouraging employment figures. Electricity shortages that had frustrated families and businesses for years were easing. The government's fiscal position was stabilizing as the country prepared for another primary budget surplus, a sign that debt-long, a heavy burden was starting to come under control. Credit agencies had taken notice too. The country had recently been upgraded, and even the FATF gray list, an international pressure point, had been resolved after 2 challenging years. These weren't just policy achievements, they were social lifelines. A more reliable grid meant small businesses could keep their lights on. A stronger credit rating meant local industries could attract investors. A stable budget meant schools, clinics, and infrastructure projects would continue receiving support. For the South African public, these improvements were more than numbers. They were the foundation of daily survival. But Ramaphosa didn't hide the difficulties. There are still headwinds, he admitted. The world was unpredictable, economies were volatile, and competition among global powers was intensifying. To withstand that pressure, South Africa needed one thing above all: a resilient private sector willing to invest across the continent. This is where the political dimension deepened. For years, South African companies had shown remarkable bravery entering markets. Others feared building operations in places critics dismissed as too unstable, too challenging, too risky. Ramaphosa recalled his own memories as chairman of MTN, facing waves of skepticism when the company expanded into Nigeria. Have they lost their heads, people asked. But history proved otherwise. South African businesses became pioneers across Africa, resilient, innovative, and adaptable. Now, he argued, was the time to harness that pioneering spirit again. The implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area (AfCFTA) would open borders, expand value chains, and create a market of 1.4 billion people on its way to 2.5 billion by mid-century. That wasn't just opportunity, that was destiny. South Africa's prosperity, he insisted, was intrinsically intertwined with the prosperity of Africa as a whole. The apartheid era had separated South Africa from the continent. The modern era demanded that it reconnect, and yet within this vision a subtle political challenge emerged. Business leaders needed assurance, protection from political risks, clarity on regulations, and support from government officials in foreign markets. Ramaphosa acknowledged this directly. The state had a responsibility not just to encourage investment, but to defend it through diplomacy, intelligence, and legal guidance. More trained representatives would be placed in embassies. Market analysis would be shared transparently. Businesses would no longer feel stranded. This commitment signaled something larger. South Africa was positioning itself as the gateway into Africa, a strategic hub where government and industry worked as one, projecting economic influence deeper into the continent. For civilians, the message brought cautious hope: a stronger economy at home, more jobs, better services, and a nation less vulnerable to global shocks. For political analysts, it marked a shift in strategy: South Africa using its domestic recovery to fuel continental leadership. By the time Ramaphosa reached the end of this section, the picture was clear. The G20 conflict wasn't merely about seating arrangements or guest lists. It was about how Africa's internal economic strength could shape its political future, and how South Africa intended to lead that transformation not alone, but alongside a continent rising with it. As the echoes of applause faded and the atmosphere settled into a deep, attentive calm, a quiet truth hung unspoken in the room. The world was watching all of this very closely. And nowhere was that scrutiny sharper than in Washington, D.C. From the American perspective, South Africa's broad G20 guest list wasn't just an unconventional choice, it was a challenge to an order the United States had grown accustomed to leading. U.S. officials spoke bluntly, saying they had whittled the G20 back to basics, suggesting that South Africa's inclusiveness was reckless, unnecessary, even destabilizing. To many observers, the remark wasn't simply about diplomacy, it revealed a deeper anxiety. Because for decades, global governance structures, whether the UN Security Council, the IMF, or the G20, were shaped overwhelmingly by Western priorities. When South Africa invited 42 nations, many from the global south, it disrupted a familiar pattern. It widened the circle, it shifted influence, and it threatened to redefine who gets to set the global agenda. To Washington, that looked like a loss of control. To Africa, it looked like long overdue balance. In Europe, reactions were more cautious. Analysts on the continent commented that South Africa's approach reflected a changing global center of gravity. Some policymakers privately agreed with the U.S. critique, worried that too much diversity in the room would slow decision-making. But others admitted, often off the record, that the world had changed, and ignoring the socio-economic rise of Africa was no longer realistic or responsible. Meanwhile, across Asia and Latin America, South Africa's stance found quiet support. Nations with their own histories of being marginalized welcomed the idea of a G20 that looked more like the world it claimed to represent. They understood the symbolism of holding the summit on African soil. They recognized the significance of finally granting the African Union a permanent seat. Global South leaders knew that this was more than symbolism. It was precedent. And then there was the broader geopolitical landscape, a world fractured by rivalries, U.S. versus China, Europe versus Russia, shifting alliances, energy battles, supply chain disruptions. In that environment, Africa's 1.4 billion people, vast mineral wealth, and expanding markets looked increasingly strategic. Washington's frustration, some analysts argued, reflected fear that an expanded G20 might weaken Western influence and empower blocs like BRICS, the African Union, and rising continental leaders. It's no coincidence that commentators began linking Ramaphosa's stance with a wider continental trend once seen in the Sahel in West Africa, and especially in countries like Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traore. A trend where African nations reject old hierarchies, demand fair partnerships, question Western dominance, assert political and economic sovereignty. This is the lens through which much of the world interpreted South Africa's G20 moment. It wasn't an isolated disagreement. It was a signal flare, a message that Africa was rewriting its role in global affairs. And what did ordinary Americans think? Many older viewers, those who remember the Cold War, the non-aligned movement, and the early days of globalization, saw this as déjà vu, a world rebalancing itself. Some believed Washington should embrace the change rather than resist it, arguing that a stable, empowered Africa benefits global peace. Others feared a dilution of Western influence. But regardless of individual opinions, one fact was undeniable. The world order was shifting, and Africa, once sidelined, was stepping into the light. South Africa's G20 presidency didn't cause that shift. It revealed it. As the evening in Johannesburg settled into a soft glow and the final words of President Ramaphosa's address lingered in the air, a sense of something larger, something historical began to take shape. This was not just a disagreement about invitations, not just political posturing. It was the quiet revelation that the world many of us grew up with, the world defined by a few powerful countries at the top and everyone else adjusting themselves underneath, is now slowly, steadily giving way to something new. But new does not always mean peaceful. New does not always mean accepted. And new does not always mean easy. That is where the warning comes in. South Africa's boldness in transforming the G20 into a more inclusive representative forum will not be embraced by every global power. Already we've seen irritation from Washington, skepticism from parts of Europe, and subtle anxiety from institutions accustomed to shaping the world on their own terms. The pushback may intensify. Pressure may come quietly or publicly. Africa's growing economic weight may become a battleground of influence rather than a celebration of progress. And so the question for us, especially those watching from afar from the comfort of living rooms in America, is simple but profound. Are we ready for a world where Africa is not on the sidelines, but at the center of global decisions? Because whether we are ready or not, that world is coming. It is visible in South Africa's G20 leadership. It is visible in the African Union's new seat at the table. And it is visible in the rising confidence of leaders across the continent. Leaders who are challenging old systems, rewriting old agreements, and standing firm in ways that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. For many Americans over 60 who have lived through the Cold War, the rise of Asia and the digital revolution, this moment may feel familiar, the unmistakable sense that the world's balance is shifting once again. But this time, the center of gravity is not Europe or China or Russia. It is Africa. And within that shift, voices like Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traore, South Africa's Ramaphosa, Mali's transitional leaders, and many others are shaping a new narrative, one rooted in sovereignty, dignity, and inclusion. So before we close this chapter, let me leave you with a final invitation. What do you think? Is South Africa right to challenge the old rules? Is Africa claiming the place it always deserved? Or is this a step too bold for the global stage? And how should America respond to a continent rising with confidence? Your voice matters. Your perspective matters. So please share your thoughts below. If you believe you're among the first to understand the deeper story behind Africa's transformation, share this video. If you believe truth matters more than headlines, subscribe to join us on this journey, because the world is changing quickly. And together we can follow every chapter of this new era in Africa news, from South Africa to Burkina Faso to the bold leadership of Ibrahim Traore.